Hello, welcome to the Eastcore. I'm Jameson Dean.
And I am Matt Boyce.
Today we have our hands on the new Nikon Z6 and we want to give a little first impressions review as well as give a chance to compare it to the Sony A7III and the Canon EOS-R. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to take turns looking at the camera and we're going to give our impressions talking about the ergonomics, the look, the feel, our impressions shooting photo as well as video. We're going to take a quick look at some of the key specifications, notably some of the pros and cons versus the other two cameras. Then we're going to quickly wrap up with our overall impressions versus the other two cameras.
So I'm first up, and I'm going to be going into the design of the camera, the ergonomics, the look, the feel. Being a Sony user since April, got used to shooting with the Sony, and when we opened the Canon box and took this out for the first time, it was sort of really nice grip and feel of the Canon. We took that out and we were sort of blown away with how this felt compared to the Sony. There was a couple things on the Canon, like the mode dial being there, and you sort of have to rely on the LCD screen when you're changing modes. Right off the bat, it's a nicer grip than the Sony. I'm not going to say it's as good as the Canon. We did notice, however, that they put the mode dial up on the left-hand side here, which has all the features on it, and you have the LCD as well, so it sort of gives you best of both worlds there. Something a little different is having the play and the delete button up at the top left-hand side. We're normally used to seeing that on the bottom right down on the Sony and the Canon. So that is something I wouldn't have chose for myself. It's something that you hit a lot and you sort of have to get your other hand involved to do that instead of just hitting play quickly with your right hand.
So we're just going to go over some quick key specs of these cameras, of the Z6. We're going to see just the basic differences between them. Now for weight, this is the lightest of the three, not by much, but it's a little bit lighter. Price-wise, it is basically the same price as the Sony. Canon is a bit more money. I think it's $300-400 more. All right, so the Nikon, thank you so much. You put in body stabilization into this bad boy, which is amazing. So now whenever you put any of your lenses on there, they're gonna be stabilized. Your video is gonna be beautiful. You're gonna be able to stop down your photos a little bit more. Nikon, thank you so much for adding the charger with this camera, unlike Sony, where you'd have to get third party, or you just have to plug in your USB-C into there and then plug it into the outlet or into your computer to charge it. Okay, Nikon, we have two cons here we got to talk about. I don't want to talk about it, but we're gonna skim it over quickly. There is one memory card slot again. Depends your workflow, what you do for your profession. Obviously, wedding photographer, you want the redundancy, so we are going to want dual card slots, obviously. Now I'm gonna talk about something else. We're gonna talk about the battery life on it. So the Nikon, the battery life is rated at 310 shots, which, you know, obviously in real world use, you're gonna be able to get more shots out of that. But if you went with the Sony, you're gonna be getting over 700 shots, and the Canon says it's rated to almost 400 shots. So the Nikon isn't the best option for battery life. You can obviously get more batteries to overcome that. Fucking A! Fuck yeah! Yeah!
Next up, we're taking a look at the LCD screen. We noticed as soon as we took this out of the box, it was the same size as the Canon LCD screen. It is the same resolution as well, which is superior to the Sony. Saying that though, I would give the advantage to the Canon LCD screen. When you look at it a little brighter, a little bit more crisp, it just seems to be a better screen somehow. Even though it's spec for spec the same. The Sony needs to improve their game when it comes to the screen. When it comes to the actual flip out of the screens, it's the exact same as the Sony. It pops out, moves up and down. I prefer this over the flip out screen for what I use it for. It does have a little bit less function because you can't flip it around and look at the other way. But for me, it's nice and easy just to be able to flip it down when you're shooting lower or you want to shoot higher, you flip it up and tilt it like that. When you're using the Canon, you got to flip it out and turn it around before you can get that motion. Yeah, look at this joystick. As soon as you touch the joystick, it takes you home. Why would that be?
Well, tell these guys.
Look it. Tell me if I'm wrong here.
It's like you can't.
Yeah, you'd think you'd be able to toggle through this joystick, right? So when it comes to buttons and menu, it is a full touchscreen unlike the Sony. The Canon and the Nikon have full touchscreen where you can toggle through the menus right on the screen. I'm not sure why Sony made that decision to make it just a focus touchscreen. So it's not a full functional touchscreen on the Sony. The Nikon seems to have the best menu system out of the three in terms of being able to scroll through fast. Now when you're using the viewfinder with the Nikon, and you want to use your thumb as a trackpad to adjust the focus area, you can't do that with the Nikon. That's something you can do with both the Canon and the Sony. It does not work with this. The actual viewfinder is the same spec as the Canon as well. The resolution is higher than the Sony.
Okay, so one thing I really wanted to take a look at and was excited about with the Z6, sorry, we're Canadian, Z6, was the autofocus system and performance. What I wanted to do was actually get an idea of the subject recognition and tracking right off the bat. One of the first things that I noticed when I picked up the Sony after being a longtime DSLR user was just how intuitive it was and how it just seemed to do so much of the work for me. And as a professional, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but it almost feels like you could give this camera to a monkey and they're going to come back with a lot of images, tack sharp right on the eye of whatever people in the frame. It's like it's reading your mind through your hand in a lot of ways, and you know, you get used to that after a while of shooting mirrorless, but when you come from a DSLR, it really is actually amazing. The Canon, I mean, it gets the job done. Now we've noticed that it takes a little bit more coercion and working just to, you know, figure out the right subject. It maybe doesn't find faces quite as far away, but it does a respectable job. I mean, it gets the job done, and it certainly is accurate, and it certainly is fast. I noticed that when I picked up the Nikon, although it does have all of the same basic features and functions for subject recognition, the great focus modes in terms of the one shot, the focus areas, the group focus modes. In terms of face recognition, subject recognition, and tracking, I just noticed you kind of have to be a little bit closer, and it isn't quite as confident in picking up the initial subject as the Canon, and certainly not the Sony. It feels like it has the technology, it just isn't quite getting there as fast. The other thing that I noticed with the Nikon is that from time to time, larger changes in focus, for example, if I'm using a larger aperture and it has to jump a further distance in focus, there were times when I actually had to manually kind of turn that focus ring on the lens just to give it an idea of, hey, this is the direction I want to go in. That's something I never really have to find myself having to do with the Sony and even with the Canon. In terms of shooting people, eye detect, well, let's just say this. It does not have eye detect. I know what you're thinking. Well, the Canon EOS-R doesn't have eye detect in continuous autofocus either. Well, here's the thing. It actually kind of does. Now, we discovered when we did a little test here that the Sony, I mean, clearly it has eye autofocus. That's one of the big draws to the system there. We did some tests with some 85mm lenses, and you hit eye detect and it's going to follow the eyes up, down, left, right, select, A, B, start. The Canon, even though it technically doesn't have continuous focus eye detect, when we used the face detect and took a bunch of shots at 85mm, we actually noticed that even though it's just showing that it's focusing on the face, it is actually focusing on the eye almost all of the time. So I mean, even though technically it doesn't say it has eye focus and continuous focus, the Canon really is delivering great focus on the eye when you're just doing face detect focus. The Nikon, on the other hand, if you're shooting people, especially with large apertures, It does not have eye focus. It has face focus, and it will hit somewhere on the face, but most of the time we found it hitting the tip of the nose or somewhere along the mouth. Usually I think wherever the closest point of focus is to the camera, most of the time it did not actually land on the eyes. So if you are going to be shooting people, you're going to probably want to stop down a little bit or override that face detect function if you're at any sort of distance where you're shooting portraits. In terms of just raw speed and accuracy using a single point in either single shot or continuous autofocus, you know, I think the Canon, this is kind of a pure horsepower monster. With that dual pixel, when you tell it, hey, I want to focus on this point, it is just blazing fast, blazing accurate. You know, I don't think really the other two cameras are quite up there. The Sony is pretty close, especially when paired with the same lens. It seems really close to the Canon, but I don't think it's quite as fast as the Canon. The Nikon, on the other hand, does a respectable job, but I just found it a little more hesitant than either of the two cameras. I think, you know, the phase detect on sensor, it's doing a decent job. It's just, again, not quite as confident as either of the two systems. I think, like I said, from a pure autofocus horsepower perspective, the Canon's got it. From a intelligence and logic perspective, the Sony's got it. The Nikon, I didn't really find any area where the Nikon has any autofocus advantage over either the Canon or the Sony. Video autofocus, I found that it does a really decent job. It does seemingly as good a job, video autofocus, especially for subject tracking, as the Sony or the Canon. There's very little, honestly, between the three systems in terms of video autofocus. It was freezing cold up here in Canada when we went out to try these things, so I mean, if I'm being brutally honest, we probably could have tested video autofocus in a lot more detail, but let's just say from our very brief freezing cold test, you know, I think they all did a pretty decent job. We certainly didn't torture test them, but all three seem to have decent video autofocus.
The Nikon is basically the same video functions as a Sony. Overall, these two cameras are better, in my opinion, for video than the Canon. The Nikon does do 10-bit 422 with your HDMI.
One thing we didn't touch on was just with the Nikon, we noticed you do need to switch between the modes. So there is the photo mode and video mode. You have to toggle between the two. That is an extra step in comparison to the Sony, where you can just hit record when you want to start recording video. One benefit that does have, though, is that switching between them two modes, it does save the settings. So if you have one mode, you're shooting photos with a flash, and then you're switching over to video without a flash, obviously, it will save the settings between the two. So that is handy for people that are shooting with different modes between photo and video.
So since the Nikon Z cameras use the new Nikon Z mount, which, I mean, it looks very promising judging just from the sheer size of the mount. Obviously, it's going to require that in the interim we use some adapters in order to use our Nikon glass. You know, the adapter does work fairly well. One thing that we noticed right off the bat, though, is it seemed to add a little bit, in fact a lot of, operational noise. So having some additional clicks and rattles and ticks, whatever you want to call it, that's definitely going to start showing up in your video recording function. So that's something to actually watch out for. We did use a few lenses. We used the 24-70 f2.8G. We had the 50mm f1.4. We also tried the Sigma Art Series 85 f1.4. All of them seem to add just a little bit of sound that you otherwise wouldn't hear.
As being a Nikon user before, when the Sony came out, it looked amazing, it looked great, so I was a little hesitant just because of all my glass within my Nikon, so I thought I'd wait for Nikon to put out what they were going to come out with the mirrorless. I decided to just go with the Sony. Haven't had any regrets since then. Now knowing what this does, I'm happy I stuck with Sony. I think it's head and shoulders above Nikon, and I think it's going to take a little while for Nikon to get where Sony is. As it stands, I'm happy with my decision to go with Sony.
Between the two cameras, although there's a lot to love in the Canon, I mean, there's a lot of things that are just so powerful, and yet other things that kind of have me scratching my head. In terms of functionality, you know, I really like the way that the buttons and dials and menus are laid out in the Nikon. Although the Nikon does seem to have, I'm going to say, a slightly weaker autofocus system than the Canon EOS-R, we do shoot video as we're shooting photography on certain jobs, and we do like to switch back and forth. And the crippled video modes of the Canon, to be honest with you, it's just not there for me. I would take the Nikon over the Canon, to be honest with you. It's well thought out. It is logically laid out. Again, even though I'm not as confident in the photo autofocus system, it's still very usable. And at the same time, those video modes, they're right on par with the Sony A7 III. Ultimately, because it does seem like a really similar package overall to the Sony A7 III, but without dual card slots and without the eye autofocus, I would, you know, still stick with the Sony A7 III. But you know what? Hey, we're right up there. We're getting really close. It's an amazing first effort. Or is this a second effort? I guess the Z7 is the first effort.
Unfortunately for me, the Nikon is not quite there yet. Although we do have a better menu system and touchscreen, a better higher resolution screen, and viewfinder, that's about where it stops. The ergonomics are a bit better in terms of the grip and the feel of the camera, but everything else, the autofocus, the logic of the Sony, the dual card slot, the battery life being more than double with the Sony, yeah, I would definitely be hands down sticking with my Sony on this, unfortunately. At this point, we're going to see what Nikon continues to bring out in the future. They are hitting, you know, some good points on this camera, but they're just not there when it comes to a direct comparison with the Sony. So we're going to take these cameras out into the field, use them for the next few weeks, and we're going to follow up with another video with a bit more in-depth review, some image quality tests, a bit more focusing tests, and we'll go from there. So if you want to see more, hit like and subscribe down below, and we'll see you guys soon.